being able to get his comments, thoughts, opinions on those topics. So we're going to hear from Tom, who's going to deliver some remarks for about 20 minutes or so, and then Tom and I will have a chat and we'll take some questions from you in the audience. So be ready with those when the moment comes. But if you will all join me in welcoming Security Minister Tom Tugendhat.
It's great to celebrate today that Labour and Tories are coming together. They're united in starving children in the UK and in Palestine. So I'd like to ask you, Minister, and anybody here with connections to the Labour Cabinet, Shadow Cabinet and the Tory Cabinet, please, would you stop starving our children in the UK?
I'm delighted to say that David Cameron has announced a huge food package for Gaza and has made an enormous difference to supporting people there. And as soon as Hamas stop fighting,
will you stop calling Yemen? Will you stop calling Yemen and sending arms to Palestine? You are sending arms to Palestine. Why are we still arming Israel? Why are we still giving Israel the bombs and bombing people in Yemen?
I look forward to the release of 120 hostages as soon as Hamas is willing to do it. Today, on International Women's Day of all days, can we please remember the women and the mothers who are held hostage by those who raped and murdered them and their families. Well, look, thank you very much indeed for the warmth of the welcome. You laid that on special. I'm very touched. I won't start as I was going to start. I'll start by saying actually that does matter. I'll start by saying actually that woman's right to protest is fundamental. And the fact that she came here made her case, and if you'll forgive me for putting it like this, I, as the Security Minister of one of the principally most powerful countries in the world, am here without men with guns chasing her out or trying to silence her, demonstrates something that I'm deeply, deeply proud of in this country. The strength of our democracy is real. It doesn't need force of arms. It does need strength of community. And that protest, and indeed the protest outside, demonstrates that. But look, let me go back to where I was going to start before that. It is a great pleasure to be here, and I have to say, looking around this hall, I'm clearly not the first person to have enjoyed the splendor of the investment of our ancestors in something that is truly majestic. Now, over the past few days, you've spent a while focusing on solving some of the toughest problems that our country does face. You've been looking at infrastructure and how it should be built, and houses and where they should go, closing the skills gap and such challenges. Now, I'm an enormous fan of Create Streets and the work that they're doing, and I respect the emphasis that Nicholas Boys-Smith places on architecture as a means of giving communities form and strength. But society isn't just about what we do or where we live. It's about who we are and what we believe. And that's why I must add one more problem, I'm afraid, to your list, and that's the challenge of extremism. And before I do, I want to remind you that in spite of the obstacles we have to overcome, it is a rare gift and a privilege to be British and to live in Britain. Now, I have to be slightly careful here because my wife is from a family of French diplomats. But upon being told by the French ambassador that if he were not a Frenchman, he would like to be an Englishman, Palmerston once famously answered, "If I were not an Englishman, I should like to be an Englishman too." His answer may have been flippant, but the ambassador's compliment was sincere. And as a country, we are in many ways unique. And many of the things that have made us unique make us unique still. One of the more unusual elements of British society is our enduring tradition of flexibility. To the irritation of many, our slightly unorthodox approach to nation building is deeply ingrained in our history. We have a flexible constitution that, by virtue of remaining uncodified, has allowed us to adapt to unforeseen circumstances and to navigate rapidly changing political realities. We have a flexible nation state that has evolved to accommodate distinct countries and peoples in our union of nations. And we have a flexible society, one that is made up of a patchwork of diaspora groups and communities that identify as British and are contributing to British society. In many countries around the world, flexibility is synonymous with compromise. It's considered a weakness, but not here. For centuries, we have purposefully built that into the fabric of our nation and turned to it as a source of strength. Now, even in the United Kingdom, that principle does, of course, have a limit. And there are some things that are simply not flexible, that aren't up for negotiation, and that we cannot compromise on. That includes, of course, our democracy, fought and paid for by previous generations in and out of uniform. And now that it is our watch, and these principles have been entrusted to our safeguarding, it is for us to guard them for the generations to come. Now, that includes the values and traditions that define who we are as a country. Principles such as liberty, decency, and respect for individuality must be defended. And more than that, required from those who choose to settle here. And of course, that includes the rule of law, our common law, which is essential to allowing our communities to cooperate and to thrive. Threats of violence and intimidation are alien to our way of doing things, and yet, despite its scale, forgive me, I do apologize. We must demand that the basic rules that govern our society are respected. Before we go on, I want to clear up some things about my role. When people think about security, they often think about the state's instinct to shut things down. Now, that isn't how I see it. The purpose of the security minister shouldn't be to lock things down, but to open them up, to guarantee people's liberties, and in doing so, to create the conditions needed for freedom and individuality to thrive. My job is to enhance freedom. That's the job of every government department. Now, as C.S. Lewis, that celebrated former columnist for the Coventry Telegraph, put it best, the state exists simply to promote and to protect the ordinary happiness of human beings in this life. A husband and wife chatting over a fire, a couple of friends having a game of darts in a pub, a man reading a book in his own room or digging his own garden. That is what the state is here for. To this list, I think we might add grieving for a much beloved head of state. For me, this became incredibly clear at the Queen's funeral. It was this country's largest ever ceremonial policing operation. It called on the skills of the security services and our armed forces. And despite its scale, I don't think anyone felt restricted or oppressed. That's because the police weren't there to take away anyone's freedom. They were there to guarantee it, and in doing so, to provide the most open and welcoming environment possible for the British people to mourn the passing of our Queen. Obviously, many of those domestic threats originate overseas, and that's why we must guard our borders from less happier people. I'd be remiss if I didn't note at least the most prominent of these foreign threats, just to remind us of what we do face. Russia has invaded both Georgia and Ukraine in the past 2 decades. In the latter case, it failed to meet its objective to overthrow the elected Ukrainian government, but consistent with the traditional Russian way of war, has caused vast casualties and inflicted misery on both Ukraine and itself. Russia has said that it seeks to destroy the Ukrainian people, and it has threatened to extend the war to other NATO allies. Its spokesmen have raised the spectre of nuclear weapons, and Putin has tried to entrench his own power by imprisoning and killing his enemies. He views the West as dissolute and weak. The irony, of course, is that his actions have just made us stronger. His strategic genius has achieved little more than NATO's continued growth, with today the welcoming of Sweden as the 32nd member. The world has awakened in recent years to the scale of the threat from China, regionally and globally. Indeed, a significant portion of the American strategic thought industry considers war with China to be inevitable over the next few years. Iran, with its proxy forces in the Houthi rebels in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and militias operating in Iraq and Syria, is an existential threat to Israel and a grave danger to Western interests in the Middle East, and even, sadly, here at home. All these countries have very active cyber efforts that need constant vigilance, a nimble defense, and strategic clarity of thought at the operational tactical levels, every bit as or more demanding than traditional kinetic warfare. These countries deploy extensive espionage assets that are growing and that demand ever greater attention to counter. And counter them we must. Threats like these can often feel one step removed, out of sight and out of mind. But we know that shots fired around the world can reverberate on the streets of Britain. We aren't always able to opt out of those fights. And the security forces, the armed forces, and the police are formidable tools. They will always be the tip of the spear when it comes to national crises. But they are not the primary guarantors of our security, nor are they our true source of strength. They are, in reality, the thin red line, the final intervention when all else has failed. Now that's because security, like freedom, doesn't come from the top down, it comes from the bottom up. Ultimately, our security rests in the strength of our social fabric, and we see the clearest examples of this in our times of need. Our resilience in the face of the pandemic came from organic and adaptable and original mutual aid between neighborhoods. Our national spirit is reflected just as much in the thousands of families who welcomed Ukrainian refugees as in those I served alongside in the military. In other words, it's in community. That web of individuals, families, friends, neighborhoods, organizations, businesses, and clubs that bind us together, these little platoons that Burke spoke about, are at the source of our resilience. They're the reason we're able to hold strong in the face of storms. They are what gives us flexibility and strength to endure. If security rests in the strength of our social fabric, then the scenes we've seen over the past few months tell us that our social fabric isn't as strong as it needs to be. The warnings could not be clearer. Pogroms in Europe or the Middle East have taught us that anti-Semitism never stops with Jews, and in Britain it's no different. Hostility towards one minority should be a warning to everyone. You can't set fire just to your neighbour's house. You'll end up setting fire to your own too. And the reason that the Prime Minister felt the need to stand on the steps of Downing Street this time last week was because a line had been crossed. The values and principles at the heart of our country are being threatened, and this is not something about which we can be flexible. The events of October the 7th are being weaponized by small groups to push a powerful and hateful and divisive ideological agenda, and to try and radicalize people here in the United Kingdom. Islamists and the extreme far right understand the source of our strength, and that's why their primary target isn't police stations or military installations. They're pitting Britain against Britain in an attack on our shared identity. Their primary target is our society. Now, before I go on, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. Islam, which is practiced peacefully by millions of British people across our country, is not the same thing as Islamism. Islamism is to Islam as fascism is to patriotism. It is an extremist ideology characterized by oppression and violence. Islamism rejects democracy. It tries to separate Muslims from the rest of society. I fought against Islamists in Afghanistan, often alongside British and Afghan Muslims. Fighting Islamism is not the same thing as fighting Islam, as those Turks, Jordanians, and Iraqis who fought ISIS with such courage can testify. Not all Islamist extremists are, of course, involved in planning terror attacks, but it's ideology of hate, denial of basic human dignity, and call for the destruction of the nation-state in favor of an imperialist caliphist ideal, all provide an incubator to violence, and the United Kingdom is a high-value target for them. Sadly, there are several thousand individuals in the United Kingdom who support violent extremism or are engaged in Islamist extremist activity. They are the most prevalent extremist threat to our nation, including to the Muslim families they are trying to tear apart. We know there are hostile actors who will try to use the conflict in the Middle East to radicalize people here in the United Kingdom. Their recruitment process is well established. First, they divide and polarize, then they isolate, target, radicalize, and finally operationalize people to carry out acts of terror here in the United Kingdom. The last four stages are the result of localized, targeted activity. They require intelligence collection and a sophisticated ground game to identify and then groom individuals. The first stage is much more straightforward. The only thing it requires is for future targets to buy into the us and them narrative. They are not alone in constructing those walls to divide us, but that narrative only works if you're targeting a weakened society. The key question is how we got to this stage. How has our society been weakened, and what should we do about it? There's no straightforward answer to the first question, but I'd like to suggest at least part of the reason for the erosion of our social fabric is the rise of identity politics, and that any viable solution must also strengthen our shared identity. By its very nature, identity politics encourages people to silo themselves and to retreat into the comfort of tribalism. As they isolate themselves, they become more defensive, more illiberal, more us versus them. What we saw in Rochdale is the inevitable result of that, a vicious form of sectarianism that doesn't have any interest in representing or improving the well-being of the community as a whole, but instead promotes the narrow interests of one particular sect. And let me be clear, identity politics is, in my view, racist. It reduces humanity to a gender, to a skin tone, to a belief. It may have been refined and weaponized in the United States, but in this country it's been adopted and is still being pushed by figures on the left and sadly on the right as well. Now, Keir Starmer may not be an identity warrior, but others in his party and others are. And fighting those forces that pull us apart demands leadership to ensure those he'll be helping to usher into power don't sow division. Now, the identity politics of the left might seek to divide, but the Conservatives have the opportunity to take a different road, to resist the temptation to weaponize our differences, to focus on what we have in common, and to harness the power that identity has to unite. And by identity, I mean our shared identity as British citizens, that recognizes the interests of my neighbor to be the same as my own, that encourages communities to unite behind the flag, not to try and tear it apart. In Afghanistan, I was proud to serve beside people from every background. When you're in a firefight, it doesn't much matter what race the man or woman on your left is, or the community they grew up in. You're animated by a common purpose. You belong to the same unit. And so it should be with our society. To borrow a phrase from the United States, we're not a white kingdom, or a black kingdom, or an Asian kingdom. We are the United Kingdom. Over the past few weeks, I've seen attempts to draw a direct line between immigration and the problem set out by the Prime Minister. And of course, immigration policy does play a role, and I cannot tell you how frustrated I often am with a system that prevents me from immediately deporting individuals who plainly pose a risk to our national security, but the laws are there to protect us all. However, extremism and the ideology of division isn't about that. People are constantly surprised when I tell them that studies show young British Muslims whose families have lived in the United Kingdom for a generation or more tend to be at more risk of being radicalized than recent immigrants. That's why, as we take action to crack down on radical extremism, it's important to remember that Islamists are as much of a threat to the Muslim community as to anyone else. not just because of their attempts to silence British Muslims who happen to disagree with them on points of theology or politics, but because, as I've often been told by Muslim parents, it's not my children that these extremists are trying to radicalize and to send to their deaths. It's theirs. That's why we're taking action to crack down on extremists and to frustrate their attempts to spread division and hate. In January, we proscribed Hizb ut-Tahrir. This is an organization whose long-term goal is to establish a caliphate under Islamic law that has attacked the legitimacy of every country from Morocco to Indonesia, that denies the lawful existence of any state or any ruler except the caliphate, and has decided and dedicated itself to spreading poison throughout our communities and many others around the world to achieve this. Now they're banned here, as they are in many countries in the Middle East. We've also redoubled our support for the PREVENT program, strengthening the guidance to tackle permissive spaces for radicalization, and driving the take-up of training courses to help protect at-risk communities and young minds. More than 1.1 million people have completed one so far. We're protecting our campuses and classrooms, encouraging our universities to harden their use of disciplinary measures by getting the police involved, and suspending student visas for unacceptable behavior, including anti-Semitic abuse. Any parent would rightly be concerned if they see extremists dictating what is acceptable and who is welcome on campus. No one wants that for their children. Our universities must be firmer in ensuring that this type of activity doesn't take place on their watch. And when we see examples of people that shouldn't be visiting our country in the first place, we're now taking action to keep them out. Just this Wednesday, The Times reported that Leila Khaled, a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, pulled out of an event after the government blocked her from receiving a visa. Now, earlier, we talked about the web of individuals, families, and organizations that bind us together and make up our community. Charities are a key part of that. And over the past few months, we've seen too many organizations with charitable status abuse their position to spread division and hate. Now, this must stop. To quote Robin Simcox in today's Telegraph, the Iranian government does not have an inalienable right to run schools and mosques in our capital city. It is not unalterable democratic principle that Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood must be allowed to run a multitude of charities. Ensuring that charities are fit for purpose is the role of the Charity Commission, and I've made it clear to the Commission that this is now the time to take a zero-tolerance approach to extremism. And where they need more resources to do so, or are in need of external expertise, I am determined to strengthen their arm so that they are able to achieve their aims. Now, I started earlier with a Palmon Quote, which, although a good showcase of his wit, isn't actually my personal favorite. My favorite was from a 4.5-hour speech, consider yourselves lucky, he delivered to the Commons in June 1850. As he was summing up, he said, "I therefore fearlessly challenge the verdict which this House, as representing a political, a commercial, a constitutional country, is to give on the question now brought before it, whether, as the Roman in days of old held himself free from indignity when he could say, civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, so also a British subject, in whatever land he may be, shall feel confident that the watchful eye and the strong arm of England will protect him against injustice and wrong." Now, that debate was over the British government's commitment to protect her subjects abroad. How much greater is our duty to protect every British citizen at home, including the young people who are being targeted by radical extremists of whatever hue and whatever origin they come. We owe that duty of protection to British citizens, to all British citizens. So whether you are a British Muslim or a British Jew, regardless of your creed or the colour of your skin, you can look up at the flag and say, Civis Britannicus sum, in full knowledge of the society to which you belong, the shared identity it represents, and knowing that the watchful eye and the strong arm of Britain will be there to protect you against injustice and wrong.
Thank you so much for that, Tom. We've got about 10 minutes or so, and so I'm going to kick off with just one question and then open it up. And I want to ask about the balance between protest and security, right? Pertinent. I want to ask about that because there are clearly some examples that you described in your remarks, which I think we would both agree, and most would agree, are absolutely things that we need to be cracking down on, protests outside MPs' homes, intimidation, threats, etc., etc. You mentioned Robin Simcox in your speech. I think he also said today that London has become a no-go zone for Jewish people on the weekends. The challenge then is the protests that are happening, the marches are to some degree perfectly reasonable, kind of reported to the police. There might be particular instances that we'd agree are unacceptable, but the protests themselves feel a very important part of British democracy. So I guess my question is, how do you think about that balance between the perfectly legitimate right to protest and a feeling of insecurity among groups, in this instance Jewish people, because of those protests? How do we balance that to create the sort of secure society you were describing?
So I think you highlight one of the biggest challenges for Britain today, which is how do you guarantee freedom when it conflicts with others? And that's a real challenge. And the challenge has to be achieved by looking at what are the basic principles that you're trying to achieve. The reason we have been so clear on protecting MPs' homes is not because MPs are particularly special in themselves. Other than my mother, I can certainly tell you that nobody else thinks I'm particularly special. But because MPs have been elected by a wider community to represent an interest. When you stop somebody standing or representing that interest, when you bully them into changing their mind, you're not just bullying an individual who may or may not agree or disagree with the position. You're actually bullying the thousands of people who sent them there. And you're undermining the very fabric of our democracy. So that's why we focused so clearly on that element of protest. When you're talking about protests in London, that's harder. And it's harder because, of course, it's right that in a free society, free people have the right to assembly, and as we saw here, to make protests as they choose to a point. But it's also right that we have the freedom to have this discussion about issues, some of which you may agree with, some of which you may not, but we can have a discussion. Because without these basic building blocks, we simply don't have a democracy. The idea that democracy is simply a ballot or an MP or a councillor is not true. This is democracy. Getting together in public forums, talking to our friends and neighbours, being free to discuss ideas, to challenge and to think, that's democracy. Democracy isn't a process, it's how we challenge ideas, it's how we get the best answer. Fundamentally, democracy is how we talk to each other.
Okay, let's do some democracy. You know what, I'll take kind of 2 or 3, because then, Tom, I'll give you a chance to answer those as a cluster. So we've got one question here, one question at the front left, and then one question in the back right. If you keep your questions quite short, that'd be really appreciated.
Mm-hmm. So you were critiquing Labour MPs for causing division. People in your party have made bigoted comments about Sadiq Khan, pushed conspiracy theories about 15-minute cities, and talked about punching Ofsted workers. Do you condemn those in your own party who incite violence and push conspiracy theories?
I'll answer that very quickly. I already have done.
Okay. You didn't in your speech, though. It's one-sided, I think.
So if all answers could be that short, that'd be amazing. Okay, there's a question just up here at the front.
Good afternoon, and thank you for holding your ground earlier on. I'm originally from Syria, Christian, so I've seen a lot of persecution, and over the last few weeks, the rise of Islamism has brought some memories and ideas which I hope they never, ever are inflicted here in Britain. So my question to you is, what reforms is the government considering to security services to make sure that Britain is ready for 21st century threats?
Okay, thank you. And then there was another question just back there. So that the hand that's just up there, Erin, if that's okay.
Hi, Tom. There was reporting in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago which suggested that MI6 has been giving information to the Ukrainian security services, information which led to the deaths of Russian soldiers. There was also leaked information in Germany in the last week or so that British soldiers are actually on the ground in Ukraine, a small number of them. I wondered while we want to keep Putin at bay, what is the acceptable level of risk that we can take with our security personnel in Ukraine at this current time? And should there be slightly more democratic oversight of some of these decisions, which to me seem quite dangerous in some ways? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've only got time for those two, apologies. So, question at the front about how we're going to make sure we reform security services to respond to modern threats, and a question about kind of democratic oversight over some of the operations around Ukraine.
Okay, well, first of all, ahlan wa sahlan. It's really good to see you here, and in Bilad al-Shams, Bilad al-Bidun Shams. It's very good to have you here, and you're very welcome. The challenges we've got are challenges that actually we've understood in different ways for many generations, and if you read the Security Service Act 1989 or the Intelligence Service Act of 1994, you'll see that the powers set out then at the end of the Cold War covered ideas that or the way in which ideas can threaten a democracy in the Intelligence Services Act then. And so it's not so much that we need reform, it's that we need we need to act on the powers that we have. And you'll forgive me, there's not very much more I can say on it, and the reason I can't is because I, for very obvious reasons, don't talk about intelligence activity in this country, I'm afraid. And to your point at the back, sir, and forgive me, I recognize you, but I can't remember your name, so I apologize. I'm afraid you're going to get the same answer on intelligence activity and indeed operational activity overseas. But you do raise a very fair question about democratic oversight, because that's a real challenge. It is, of course, right that as a country we must have the ability to protect ourselves. We can't simply be publishing our operational plans on the internet in order to help our enemies. I mean, nobody would see that as a sensible way to go. But it is absolutely clear that we must have oversight, and we can't have ministers or prime minister even making decisions without oversight. And the way we construct that is we have various different groups. So the ISC, the Intelligence and Security Committee, overlooks the work in the intelligence services, and various others are brought in to challenge at various different points. In fact, I have been party to various briefings with members of the opposition parties so that they're aware of what's going on and can challenge in private, even if they can't challenge on the floor of the chamber. And all of those different elements are how we do keep that challenge function going. It is something that has to constantly evolve, though, because the reality is as intelligence evolves, as the nature of the threat evolves, we are constantly looking at ways in which that's going to change.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tom. If you could all join me in giving Tom Tugendhat a round of applause. Just 1 second. If you would give us just 1 moment, we're going to sort the stage for the next speaker. I was going to say, luckily, it's less controversial, but it's on 15-minute cities, so they'll swap the protesters outside. We'll do the whole thing again, but we'll be ready to go in just a moment. Okay.
Okay. Please take your seats. For those standing at the back, there are a few seats going spare at the front. So if the happy chatter can just die gracefully away. I'd like to say well done, thank you. We started at 8 o'clock this morning. It's now 4:20. We're only running 10 minutes late, which, I think is what you need after a long day. It's my huge pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce my friend, Professor Carlos Moreno. We're going to be discussing 15-minute cities, but also much more than that. Are they an old idea or a new one? Are they the path to sustainable living or a red herring? Carlos, I think it's fair to say, he will correct me if I make any mistakes, actually didn't start as an urbanist or as someone focused